November 18th, 1978, a date that would sear itself into the collective consciousness of America and the world. In a remote jungle clearing in Guyana, South America, over 900 men, women, and children lay dead, victims of the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history until the attacks of September 11th. The name Jonestown would forever become synonymous with blind obedience, fanaticism, and the terrible power one man could wield over hundreds of willing followers. That man was Jim Jones, charismatic preacher, self-proclaimed messiah, and architect of one of the most harrowing tragedies of the 20th century. Before the bodies, before the cyanide-laced punch, before Congressman Leo Ryan lay dead on an airstrip, there was a vision of racial harmony, social equality, and communal living that attracted hundreds of idealistic Americans to follow Jones from the heartland of Indiana to California, and ultimately to that fateful jungle commune in Guyana. He was the most charismatic person I'd ever met, recalls former Temple member Deborah Layton. When Jim Jones walked into a room, you felt like the air changed. He had this ability to make you feel that he alone truly understood you, that he alone could see your potential. This magnetic pull, this almost supernatural ability to inspire devotion, was Jim Jones's greatest gift and the world's undoing. A man who began his ministry preaching against segregation in 1950s Indiana would end it ordering the deaths of hundreds who trusted him completely. The path from idealistic preacher to paranoid dictator is as complex as it is disturbing. Jones didn't simply wake up one morning and decide to lead his followers to mass death. His descent into madness and megalomania was gradual, calculated, and enabled by a perfect storm of social conditions, psychological manipulation, and political protection. Dr. Margaret Singer, who studied cults extensively, noted, "Jim Jones didn't invent mind control techniques. What made him exceptional was his instinctive understanding of human vulnerability and his willingness to exploit it without remorse." In this investigation, we'll trace Jones's journey from his troubled childhood in Lynn, Indiana, through his rise as a charismatic religious leader, to the final horrific days in Jonestown. We'll examine how a movement that began with integration and social justice devolved into isolation, paranoia, and mass death. The story of Jonestown isn't simply about a madman and his followers. It's about the fragility of human psychology, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the thin line between utopian idealism and dystopian reality. It's a warning that continues to echo through time, demanding we ask ourselves, how well do we know those we choose to follow? And at what point does devotion become destruction? This is Chapter 1 of Drinking the Poison, the Tragedy of Jonestown. James Warren Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in the rural farming community of Crete, Indiana, during the depths of the Great Depression. His early years were marked by poverty and family dysfunction that would shape his worldview and fuel his later obsessions with power and control. Jimmy was a strange, lonely child, recalls Myrtle Kennedy, a childhood neighbor. While other boys were playing baseball, he would be conducting elaborate funeral services for dead animals he found. He seemed fascinated by death from a very young age. Jones's father, James Thurman Jones, was a disabled World War I veteran who struggled with alcoholism and rarely held steady employment. His mother, Lynetta, was forced to work long hours as a factory worker, leaving young Jim largely to fend for himself. This early abandonment created a deep-seated insecurity that Jones would spend his lifetime trying to overcome. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, psychiatrist and author who studied thought reform and psychology of totalism, observed, "Children who experience profound neglect often develop an intense need to control their environment." In Jones's case, this manifested as an almost pathological need to control others as a way of managing his own internal chaos. By age 10, Jones was already displaying unusual religious preoccupations. Neighbors reported seeing him conduct his own church services in his family's barn, complete with passionate sermons delivered to neighborhood children. These early performances revealed his natural gift for oratory and manipulation, talents that would later serve him with devastating effectiveness. Jones's childhood fascination with religion took a darker turn when he began studying the lives of political figures like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong. He was particularly drawn to their mass rallies and their ability to command absolute loyalty. According to childhood friends, Jones would sometimes practice Hitler's speaking techniques, studying how the dictator used emotional crescendos to whip crowds into a frenzy. At 16, Jones began attending services at a Pentecostal church in Lynn, where he was captivated by the emotional intensity of worship, speaking in tongues, and faith healing. The theatrical elements of Pentecostalism, the music, the cathartic release, the communal experience, provided a blueprint for his own future ministry. What Jim understood early on was that religion wasn't just about belief, explains religious studies professor Catherine Wessinger. It was about experience, creating moments of such emotional intensity that rational thought is suspended, and the group becomes one emotional entity that can be directed and controlled. After briefly attending Indiana University, Jones married nurse Marceline Baldwin in 1949, and by 1952 had begun his own ministry. But unlike most preachers of the era, Jones didn't limit himself to traditional Christian theology. He blended elements of Pentecostalism with social gospel teachings, faith healing, and increasingly socialist political ideology. Former Temple member Tim Carter recalls, Jim would say, "What good is heaven in the afterlife when people are suffering in the here and now?" He used the Bible as a starting point, but he was always more interested in creating heaven on earth than preparing people for the next world. Jones's theological innovations weren't random. They served specific psychological and strategic purposes. His emphasis on faith healing gave him the aura of divine power. His focus on social justice attracted idealistic followers, and his gradual introduction of socialist principles provided an alternative framework as he systematically dismantled his followers' traditional Christian beliefs. By 1955, Jones had established his own congregation in Indianapolis, the People's Temple. The unusual spelling "peoples" without the apostrophe was deliberate, emphasizing collective ownership over individualism. It was here that Jones began refining the ideological blend that would define his movement. A mixture of Christianity, socialism, racial equality, and apocalyptic fear that the world was heading toward nuclear annihilation. The die was cast. The patterns that would lead to tragedy were already emerging. Jones's need for absolute control, his manipulation of religious emotion, his political radicalization, and his growing conviction that he alone could save his followers from a doomed world. In 1955, Indiana was a city deeply divided by racial segregation. Neighborhoods were sharply delineated by color lines, restaurants refused service to Black Americans, and churches remained among the most segregated institutions in American life. It was against this backdrop that Jim Jones formally established the People's Temple, intentionally spelled without an apostrophe to emphasize collective rather than individual ownership. From its inception, the People's Temple presented itself as radically different from other churches of the era. Where most congregations quietly accepted or even defended segregation, Jones boldly proclaimed racial equality as a cornerstone of his ministry. During Sunday services, Jones would often dramatically tear pages from the Bible, declaring, "This black book has been used to keep black people and poor white people down for too long." Charles Jackson, an early black member of the temple, remembers, "The first time I walked into that church and saw black people and white people worshiping together, sharing meals together, calling each other brother and sister, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced in Indiana." Jim was living what other preachers only talked about. The temple's integrated services were more than symbolic. Jones adopted a black child, naming him Jim Jones Jr., one of the first recorded instances of a white minister adopting a black child in Indiana. He appointed black members to leadership positions and established social outreach programs targeting impoverished communities regardless of race. What Jones called apostolic socialism formed the theological basis for the temple's activities. Drawing selectively from the Bible, particularly Acts 4:32-35, which describes early Christians sharing their possessions, Jones crafted a message that merged Christianity with socialist principles. Jesus was the first communist, Jones would often declare to his congregation. He did not believe in private property. He believed in sharing equally among all people. Dr. Rebecca Moore, religious studies scholar and sister of two Jonestown victims, explains. Jones started with familiar Christian concepts but gradually shifted their meaning. Salvation became less about personal redemption and more about collective liberation from oppression. Heaven wasn't an afterlife destination, but a socialist society that could be created on earth. The temple's social gospel wasn't just rhetoric. The organization established communal housing, free medical clinics, soup kitchens, and job assistance programs. Temple members created a nursing home for the elderly, regardless of their ability to pay. These concrete benefits provided tangible proof of Jones's message and attracted those marginalized by mainstream society. The People's Temple fed the hungry when they were hungry, recalls former member Hugh Fortson Jr. They clothed people who needed clothes. They helped people find jobs who needed jobs. And they did it without asking, "What color are you?" They just wanted to know if you needed help. What made the temple particularly appealing during this period was the contrast between Jones' message and the violent backlash against the civil rights movement. As police turned fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters in the South, Jones offered an alternative vision, a beloved community where racial harmony already existed. Jones's message resonated deeply with Black Americans frustrated by the glacial pace of social change and with white liberals seeking absolution from America's racial sins. For working-class whites suffering economic hardship, Jones offered an explanation that redirected their anger away from racial scapegoating and toward class consciousness. Temple member Mike Cartmel later reflected, "Jim gave us an analysis that made sense of the world. He taught us that racism was a tool used by the wealthy to keep poor people divided against each other. He made us feel like we were part of something bigger, a movement that could actually transform society." By the early 1960s, the People's Temple had grown to several hundred members. Jones's sermons increasingly framed society's problems in terms of class struggle rather than personal sin. Traditional Christian concepts like salvation through Christ were gradually reinterpreted or de-emphasized in favor of salvation through social action and commitment to the collective. Jim would say, "What you need to believe in is what you can see," recalls Temple member Laura Johnston Cole. You can see people working together. You can see racism being overcome. You can see hungry people being fed. That's your salvation right there. However, beneath the temple's progressive public face, disturbing patterns were emerging. Jones began demanding increasing levels of commitment and loyalty from members. Public confessions of wrongdoing became common during services, and Jones positioned himself not just as a pastor, but as the embodiment of divine principle, what he called God and socialism, whose authority couldn't be questioned. By 1965, Jones had established the foundation that would define the People's Temple throughout its existence, a message of racial equality and social justice that attracted idealistic followers, concrete programs that demonstrated the benefits of membership, and a leadership structure that concentrated absolute power in Jones's hands. The temple's days in Indianapolis were numbered. By 1965, Jim Jones had grown increasingly paranoid about nuclear apocalypse, claiming to have received visions of Indianapolis being destroyed in a nuclear attack. This fear, combined with mounting scrutiny of his unconventional practices, prompted Jones to seek a new home for his growing congregation. Jones selected Redwood Valley, California, a small community near Ukiah in Mendocino County, as the temple's next base. He consulted an Esquire magazine article listing safe locations that would survive nuclear fallout, and methodically led approximately 140 loyal followers westward in a caravan of buses and cars. Jim told us California was the promised land, remembered Hyacinth Thrash, one of the temple's elderly Black members. He said God had shown him that Indiana would be destroyed, but we would be saved if we followed him to California. When Jim spoke with such conviction, you believed him. The relocation marked a strategic shift for Jones. Far from major population centers, the isolated Redwood Valley location allowed him to tighten his grip on members while rebuilding his organization, away from the watchful eyes of Indiana authorities and press. Under Jones's direction, the temple established a rigorous communal lifestyle, with members pooling resources and working collectively on the temple's agricultural projects. By the early 1970s, however, Jones recognized that real political power lay in California's urban centers. The temple expanded strategically, establishing branches in San Francisco and Los Angeles while maintaining its Redwood Valley headquarters. This urban expansion coincided with Jones's increasing political ambitions. Jim was extremely politically savvy, said former San Francisco District Attorney Terrence Hallinan. He understood that in California politics, particularly in San Francisco, any group that could deliver hundreds of disciplined, enthusiastic volunteers and voters would be courted by politicians. San Francisco, with its progressive politics and diverse population, proved particularly fertile ground for Jones's brand of activism. The temple became known for mobilizing its members for political rallies, neighborhood cleanups, and social justice causes. Temple members, predominantly dressed in their Sunday best, became a familiar sight at city commission meetings and political functions. Jones systematically cultivated relationships with California's political elite. The temple's newspaper published flattering interviews with politicians. Temple members wrote thousands of letters supporting political candidates. Most importantly, Jones could deliver something politicians desperately needed: bodies. Hundreds of temple members could be mobilized with a single command to attend rallies, stuff envelopes, or cast votes. The political breakthrough came in 1975 when George Moscone narrowly won San Francisco's mayoral race. Temple members had campaigned vigorously for Moscone, and Jones later claimed credit for the victory. Whether or not the temple actually delivered the deciding votes became irrelevant once Moscone appointed Jones to chair the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission, a powerful position overseeing public housing across the city. California Lieutenant Governor Mervyn DeMalle recalled, "Jim Jones represented a constituency that had been marginalized. He brought poor people, black people, seniors into the political process. Politicians saw the temple as a model of political engagement." The temple's political machine reached its zenith in 1976 when Jones hosted a dinner attended by Governor Jerry Brown, Lieutenant Governor DeMalle, and Assemblyman Willie Brown, among others. Rosalind Carter, wife of then-presidential candidate Jimmy Carter, even met with Jones during the campaign. Photos of Jones with these political luminaries adorned temple publications, conferring legitimacy that helped silence critics. These political connections gave Jones a protective shield, explained journalist Marshall Kilduff. When people raised concerns about the temple, politicians would say, "I know Jim Jones. He's doing good work." It made it much harder to investigate allegations of abuse. Behind the scenes, the temple was evolving into something far more sinister than a politically connected church. Jones demanded absolute loyalty, requiring members to sign false confessions that could be used against them if they defected. Physical punishment for violating temple rules became common. Armed guards patrolled temple properties. The organization's structure evolved into concentric circles of commitment and knowledge. Casual attendees at the periphery saw only the temple's charitable work and progressive politics. Inner members experienced the temple's true nature: sleep deprivation, physical discipline, sexual humiliation, and Jones's increasing claims of divine authority. "There was public Jim and private Jim," said temple defector Deborah Layton. Public Jim hugged children, healed the sick, and spoke passionately about justice. Private Jim was paranoid, cruel, and obsessed with loyalty. As you moved closer to him in the organization, you saw more of Private Jim. As Jones's power grew, so did his excesses. He flaunted his political connections to intimidate members against leaving. When concerns were raised about temple practices, Jones could count on testimonials from respected politicians to deflect scrutiny. Meanwhile, he was amassing a fortune through donations, members surrendering their assets, and fraudulent schemes involving welfare and Social Security benefits. The political protection Jones cultivated would soon prove inadequate, however. By 1977, investigative journalists and former members were preparing to expose the abuses within the temple. Jones, sensing the impending crisis, began implementing his most drastic contingency plan: the establishment of an agricultural project deep in the jungles of Guyana, safely beyond the reach of American authorities. To understand the extraordinary control Jim Jones exerted over his followers, We must examine the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that transform the People's Temple from a church into what psychologists now recognize as one of history's most textbook examples of a destructive cult. Jones didn't simply stumble upon effective methods of control. He studied them meticulously. Former Temple member Laura Johnston Cole recalls, Jim had books about Hitler, about Stalin, about Father Divine. He studied how these men commanded absolute devotion. He learned from them and then improved on their techniques. At the core of Jones's methodology was a systematic assault on individual identity. New members were initially love-bombed, showered with attention, affection, and acceptance. For individuals who felt marginalized by society, particularly African Americans, the elderly, and the economically disadvantaged, this manufactured sense of belonging was intoxicating. The genius of Jim Jones was his ability to identify what people desperately needed and then position himself as the exclusive provider of that need, explains cult psychology expert Dr. Margaret Singer. For many Temple members, especially those who had experienced discrimination, Jim offered not just community, but a vision of racial equality that seemed revolutionary. Once hooked by this initial acceptance, members were gradually subjected to a process experts call milieu control, the regulation of information and communication. Temple members were encouraged to live communally, work at Temple businesses, and socialize exclusively with other members. Outside news was filtered through Jones's interpretations during lengthy sermons, where he would spin world events to fit his apocalyptic narrative. Former Temple leadership member Terry Buford described this isolation. After a while, you only heard Jim's voice, only read what Jim allowed, only spoke to people who reinforced Jim's messages. Your reality became whatever Jim said it was. Sleep deprivation served as another powerful tool. Temple services routinely lasted until the early morning hours, particularly as the organization became more controlling. Members would then be expected to perform their regular work duties on minimal sleep, creating a state of chronic exhaustion that impaired critical thinking. When you're exhausted, your resistance drops, explains social psychologist Dr. Robert Cialdini. The ability to scrutinize arguments, to question authority figures. These cognitive functions require energy that sleep-deprived individuals simply don't have. The Temple's confessional system represented another masterful control mechanism. Members were required to write detailed confessions of real or imagined transgressions, including false admissions of crimes, sexual improprieties, or counter-revolutionary thoughts. These documents could be used to blackmail anyone who considered leaving or speaking out. Public humiliation rituals, which Jones called catharsis sessions, further eroded individual will. In these frightening ordeals, Temple members would be verbally attacked by the entire community for hours, sometimes physically beaten, all while Jones observed from his throne-like chair. These public humiliations served multiple purposes, notes cult researcher Dr. John Jalalich. They demonstrated Jones's total power. They kept everyone in a state of anxiety about being the next target, and they conditioned members to participate in abusing others, making them complicit in the system of control. Jones brilliantly exploited fundamental principles of social psychology. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments had shown how readily ordinary people defer to perceived authority figures. Jones positioned himself as the ultimate authority, Father, as all members were required to call him, who claimed divine powers and special knowledge. The concept of cognitive dissonance helps explain how intelligent people remained even when confronted with Jones's increasingly bizarre behavior. Having sacrificed so much to join the Temple, relationships, possessions, careers, members became psychologically invested in believing it was worthwhile. The greater their sacrifices, the more committed they became to justifying those sacrifices by maintaining their belief in Jones. It's a mistake to think Temple members were stupid or weak-willed, emphasizes former cult member and psychologist Dr. Paul Morantz. Many were idealists who initially joined for noble reasons. The psychological techniques Jones employed could work on almost anyone under the right circumstances. Perhaps most insidiously, Jones gradually introduced the concept of revolutionary suicide years before the final tragedy. Through repeated white knight drills, simulated crisis situations where members were told they must die rather than surrender to enemies. Jones normalized the unthinkable. Survivor Odell Rhodes later testified, "We rehearsed our own deaths so many times that when the real moment came, many people had already accepted it as inevitable. Jim had convinced us there was no life possible outside the temple." By the time the temple relocated to Jonestown, the psychological conditioning was so complete that most members were incapable of recognizing the reality of their situation. Isolated in the jungle, subjected to Jones's voice broadcasting continuously over loudspeakers, malnourished and exhausted, they had lost the capacity for independent thought. What makes the Jonestown tragedy so disturbing isn't just the number of victims, but how it demonstrates the vulnerability of the human mind to systematic manipulation. As Temple defector Deborah Layton would later write in her memoir, "No one joins a cult. You join a self-help group, a religious community, a political movement. They only become cults after you realize you're trapped." By 1977, Jim Jones's paranoia had reached a fevered pitch. The walls were closing in on his carefully constructed empire in San Francisco. What had once been a celebrated progressive church was increasingly coming under scrutiny, and Jones knew his time in America was running short. The breaking point came on a warm summer evening in August 1977. Jones sat in his San Francisco Temple office when an editor from New West magazine called. The journalist read portions of an exposé about to be published, detailing allegations of physical abuse, financial fraud, and sexual coercion within the People's Temple. Former members had broken their silence, and their stories painted a disturbing picture of life under Jones's leadership. That very night, Jones made the decision. Without waiting for the article to hit newsstands, he and several hundred of his most loyal followers fled to Guyana, where for years he had been quietly developing a contingency plan, a remote agricultural project that would become known to history as Jonestown. The People's Temple had begun investigating international locations years earlier. Temple attorney Tim Stone had drafted an immediate action plan as early as 1973, listing various escape options should the organization face what Jones termed fascist persecution. The Caribbean had always been high on the list. Why Guyana? Former Temple member Tim Carter explained, "We chose Guyana because it was an English-speaking socialist country with a government that included black leaders. Jones convinced us we could create a racial utopia there, free from American racism and capitalism." The location served multiple strategic purposes. The newly independent nation eagerly welcomed American investment, especially near its disputed border with Venezuela. Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, himself a self-described socialist, saw potential advantages in hosting the well-funded American group. And Jones, always the master manipulator, cultivated relationships with Guyanese officials, hinting at the temple's substantial financial resources and political connections. Most crucially, Jones recognized that Guyana's remote jungles would provide the perfect environment to tighten his control. As Temple defector Deborah Layton later wrote, "Jones knew that in Guyana he could isolate us completely. There would be no nosy reporters, no family members trying to make contact, no way for anyone to leave without his permission." The temple negotiated a lease of nearly 4,000 acres of dense jungle, over 150 miles from the capital, Georgetown. The soil was poor, the climate unforgiving, the location deliberately inaccessible. Visitors would need to fly to Georgetown, then take another plane to Port Katuma, followed by a 6-mile journey down a muddy road. The first contingent of temple members arrived in 1974 to begin building what Jones promoted as an agricultural paradise. Those early pioneers endured harsh conditions, clearing jungle by hand, constructing rudimentary housing, battling insects and disease. All while Jones remained in San Francisco, enjoying his political influence and comfortable lifestyle. But as Jones promoted Jonestown to his San Francisco congregation, he painted an idyllic picture that bore little resemblance to reality. "There are no mosquitoes in Jonestown," he claimed in one recorded sermon, despite the settlement being in a tropical rainforest. "The soil is so rich you can grow anything. We have free health care, beautiful housing, and no racism." Edith Roller, a temple member who kept detailed journals later recovered by the FBI, wrote in March 1978, The condition of the cottages is far worse than I was led to believe. Many have roofs that leak badly, walls that do not keep out the elements. Even after the mass exodus from San Francisco, Jones continued cultivating political protection. Temple member Paula Adams began a sexual relationship with Guyana's ambassador to the United States. Jones boasted of other female Temple members he called public relations women, serving the cause through relationships with officials. The protection these connections provided was reinforced by Jones's claimed political influence back in the United States. When Deputy Minister Ptolemy Reed traveled to Washington in 1977, Vice President Walter Mondale reportedly asked him, "How's Jim?" A question that convinced Guyanese officials that Jones had serious political backing. As hundreds and eventually nearly 1,000 Americans relocated to Jonestown throughout 1977 and early 1978, they overwhelmed Guyana's immigration system. Jones leveraged this to negotiate special arrangements that would make it nearly impossible for Temple members to leave without his approval. By early 1978, Jones had achieved his goal: complete isolation. There were no telephones connecting Jonestown to the outside world. All communication went through a single shortwave radio controlled by Jones and his inner circle. Mail was censored. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and Jones's voice echoed throughout the settlement day and night through a sophisticated public address system. Jonestown wasn't just geographically isolated, explained survivor Tim Carter. It was informationally isolated. The only news we received was filtered through Jim. The only voice of authority was Jim's, and he told us that forces were gathering to destroy us. In this remote outpost, far from media scrutiny and legal accountability, Jones's behavior grew increasingly erratic and controlling. The man who had once been a charismatic civil rights advocate transformed into an authoritarian leader who claimed to be the reincarnation of Lenin, obsessed with enemies and conspiracies. A socialist paradise? Perhaps that had once been the dream. But as 1978 progressed, Jonestown was becoming something far darker. A prison camp where Jones would stage his final terrible act. Deep in the remote jungles of northwestern Guyana, more than 150 miles from the capital of Georgetown, a group of American pioneers began transforming 3,800 acres of dense vegetation into what they believed would be their promised land. Starting in 1974, the first wave of People's Temple members arrived with machetes and determination, tasked with creating the infrastructure for what Jim Jones promised would be a socialist utopia. "We're building a new world," Jones proclaimed in sermons broadcast to his San Francisco congregation. "A place where the racist, sexist, capitalist oppression of America cannot reach us. A place where we will finally live as equals, sharing everything, wanting for nothing." The early construction phase was grueling. Settlers worked from dawn to dusk in sweltering heat and suffocating humidity. They cleared jungle, erected simple wooden structures with palm-thatched roofs, and planted crops in soil that would prove disappointingly infertile. Despite Jones's claims of agricultural abundance, the reality was far harsher. The ground was hard clay, recalled survivor Hyacinth Thrash, not the rich soil Jim had described. We couldn't grow enough to feed ourselves, let alone create the agricultural showcase he kept talking about. By mid-1977, about 500 Temple members had relocated to Jonestown. Then came the pivotal moment, the mass exodus triggered by the pending New West magazine expose. Within weeks, the population nearly doubled, creating immediate housing shortages and straining the settlement's limited resources. People were packed into dormitory-style cottages, remembered Tim Carter. Privacy became a luxury no one could afford. Families were separated, with children housed communally away from their parents. The housing we'd been promised, individual family cabins with modern amenities, simply didn't materialize for most people. While Jones had described modern facilities with running water and electricity, most structures were rudimentary at best. The few buildings with electricity ran on generators that frequently broke down. Tropical downpours leaked through hastily constructed roofs. Latrines overflowed during heavy rains. In contrast, Jones established himself in a relatively comfortable cabin that included one of the few refrigerators in Jonestown. Though small by American standards, His accommodation stood in stark contrast to the crowded communal housing where most residents slept on bunks stacked 3 high. The daily schedule was relentlessly demanding. Work began at 6:30 a.m., after a breakfast that typically consisted of rice and watery gravy. 6 days a week, temple members labored in the fields, construction sites, or kitchens until 6 p.m., with 1 hour for lunch. Evenings were consumed by mandatory meetings that often lasted until midnight or later. After working all day in that heat, we'd have to sit through hours of Jim reading news reports and lecturing us about socialism, said survivor 1L Smart. People would fall asleep sitting up, and they'd be publicly humiliated if they were caught. Jones implemented a system deliberately modeled after what he claimed was practiced in North Korea. 8 hours of work followed by 8 hours of study. These evening sessions increasingly focused on loyalty tests, political indoctrination, and preparations for what Jones termed revolutionary suicide. The settlement's isolation was not accidental but strategic. The nearest airstrip was 6 miles away at Port Katuma. During rainy seasons, the dirt road connecting Jonestown to the outside world became an impassable mud pit. The settlement's only reliable communication was a shortwave radio controlled entirely by Jones and his inner circle. Despite having access to an estimated $26 million in temple funds by late 1978, Jones kept most residents in deprivation. Meals grew increasingly sparse, sometimes just rice and beans. Medical supplies were limited, with severe outbreaks of diarrhea and fever affecting half the community in February 1978. Meanwhile, shipments of cyanide arrived regularly, ostensibly for a jewelry-making operation. "We were told we were building a model community," said survivor Odell Rhodes, "but we were really building a prison. The beautiful wooden houses in the promotional photos were just for show, built along the main path where visitors would see them. Behind them were crowded dormitories where most people actually lived." As the population swelled to nearly 1,000 by mid-1978, the disconnect between Jones's promises and the harsh reality became impossible to ignore. Yet leaving was not an option. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Passports were confiscated. The jungle itself formed a natural barrier, with the nearest town days away on foot through dense, unfamiliar terrain. Jonestown had been sold as paradise but had become a pressure cooker, isolated, overcrowded, and entirely under the control of a man whose mental stability was rapidly deteriorating. Dawn came to Jonestown with the sounds of loudspeakers crackling to life. The voice of Jim Jones filled every corner of the settlement, unavoidable and omnipresent. "Good morning, comrades," he would begin, before launching into hours of rambling commentary on world events, perceived threats, and socialist doctrine. You couldn't escape his voice, recalled Jonestown survivor Laura Johnston Cole. It was with us during meals, during work, even in our sleep. The speakers were never turned off. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd broadcast emergency alerts just to see how quickly we'd respond. The daily routine was strictly regimented. Breakfast at 7 a.m. consisted of rice, sometimes with watery gravy or oatmeal when supplies allowed. Children were immediately separated from parents and sent to the communal nursery or school, where they received heavy doses of political indoctrination alongside basic education. "We were taught that the outside world wanted to destroy us," remembered stepson Jim Jones Jr. From the youngest ages, children were told that the U.S. government would torture them if they were captured. They were shown films of supposed American atrocities and told this would happen to them if they ever left. Work assignments were distributed by Jones's lieutenants, with residents divided into agricultural teams, kitchen crews, construction squads, and security details. The tropical heat made field work particularly grueling, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees with crushing humidity. Deborah Layton, who escaped Jonestown months before the massacre, described the controlled information environment. "We were completely cut off from independent news. Everything we knew about the outside world came through Jim's filter. He would read news reports, but they were heavily edited or completely fabricated to reinforce his narratives about capitalism collapsing and racial genocide being planned in America. The settlement's physical layout reinforced control. A central pavilion served as the community's gathering place, surrounded by dormitory-style housing arranged in concentric circles. Jones's cabin stood apart with his elite security team, the Red Brigade, housed nearby. Guard towers were positioned along the perimeter, ostensibly to protect against mercenaries but effectively preventing escape. The punishment for attempting to escape was severe, said Vernon Gosney, who later fled with Congressman Ryan. People caught planning to leave were drugged, sometimes for weeks. They were placed in the box, a small underground cell where they would be held in total darkness, often upside down. Public beatings became increasingly common. Jonestown's disciplinary system evolved into a sophisticated mechanism of control. Public humiliation was a primary tool, with catharsis sessions, where individuals would be brought before the entire community for criticism. These sessions sometimes lasted hours, with the accused forced to confess to imagined crimes against the cause. What broke people wasn't just the physical punishment, explained survivor Tim Carter. It was watching your friends turn against you, hearing your own children condemn you. The psychological torture was far more effective than any beating. Food became increasingly scarce as 1978 progressed. Despite propaganda films showing abundant harvests, the settlement never achieved self-sufficiency. Most protein came from small tins of fish divided among multiple people. Meanwhile, Jones maintained his own supply of eggs, fresh fruit, and meat. Relationships were strictly controlled. Sexual partners required Jones's approval, and he often separated couples he viewed as too devoted to each other rather than to him. Families were deliberately fragmented, with children raised communally and parents allowed limited access. "We were told our children belonged to the collective, not to us," said Claire Gennaro, who lost her 2 children in the massacre. If you showed too much attention to your own child, you were labeled bourgeois and selfish. Meanwhile, everyone was expected to call Jones father or dad, even the adults. Medical care was provided by temple members with minimal training, using limited supplies. Dr. Larry Schacht, Jones's personal physician, had received his medical education with temple funds but lacked proper facilities in Jonestown. Residents with chronic conditions often went without proper medication, while Jones hoarded pharmaceuticals for his own use. Perhaps most disturbing were the White Nights, crisis drills where Jones would wake the entire settlement with sirens and gathered everyone in the pavilion. During these exercises, he would claim that mercenaries or CIA agents were approaching to destroy them. "He would give us choices," recalled Stanley Clayton, one of the few survivors of the final day. "Fight the invaders, run into the jungle, flee to Russia, or die by our own hands." Then he'd have us drink what he said was poison. We'd wait to die terrified, only to be told later it was a loyalty test. As months passed, the boundary between these drills and reality blurred. Isolation, exhaustion, malnutrition, and constant fear created a community where the unthinkable gradually became accepted as inevitable. Jim Jones's arrival in Guyana marked the beginning of a disturbing physical and mental decline that would accelerate throughout Jonestown's existence. The once charismatic preacher who had commanded respect across California's political landscape deteriorated before his followers' eyes. By mid-1978, Jones had become virtually unrecognizable to those who knew him in his prime. His once robust frame had withered dramatically, with estimates suggesting he lost between 30 and 40 pounds in just a matter of weeks. His skin developed an unhealthy pallor, and witnesses described grotesque swelling in his extremities during his final months. "His appearance shocked me," recalled reporter Tim Reiterman, who interviewed Jones shortly before the massacre. "His eyes were glazed and distant. He would drift off mid-sentence, sometimes staring into space before continuing with an entirely different thought. The mental deterioration was as evident as the physical." Jones's speech, once his most powerful tool for persuasion, became slurred and disjointed. On recovered audio recordings, his voice sounds weak and rambling, with words running together and sentences left unfinished. Even when reading prepared statements over the community's loudspeaker system, he struggled to maintain coherence. Temple physician Dr. Lawrence Schacht kept Jones supplied with an alarming array of pharmaceuticals. According to survivors, Jones regularly abused Valium, Quaaludes, Demerol, and various stimulants. Medical notes recovered after the massacre referenced Jones suffering from high blood pressure, temporary blindness, and convulsions. He was constantly medicated, remembered Jonestown resident Juanita Bogue. Sometimes he'd nod off during meetings, and his aides would have to shake him awake. Other times he'd be manically energetic, talking for hours without stopping. Jones's paranoia reached clinical levels in Jonestown. In recordings of his addresses to the community, he describes elaborate conspiracy theories involving the CIA, FBI, and what he called fascist forces, plotting to destroy his socialist paradise. These delusions became increasingly bizarre as his mental state deteriorated. In one particularly disturbing recording from October 1978, Jones can be heard telling his followers, "There's no way we can survive. They're coming for us. Right now there are mercenaries training in the jungle. They're going to parachute in and torture every last one of you. They'll take the babies and dash their brains out while you watch." This heightened paranoia manifested in increasingly strict security measures. Jones doubled the armed guards patrolling Jonestown's perimeter and established a round-the-clock radio communications center that maintained constant contact with the Temple Loyalists in Georgetown and San Francisco. The walls were closing in on his mind, explained psychologist Dr. Margaret Singer, who studied the Jonestown tragedy extensively. As his grasp on reality weakened, his need for absolute control intensified. It's a classic progression in deteriorating cult leaders. Jones's messages to his followers took on apocalyptic tones. Where once he had preached social justice and racial equality, he now focused obsessively on death, betrayal, and revenge. The socialist utopia he had promised was replaced by a siege mentality where survival itself seemed temporary. In a recorded community meeting from September 1978, Jones stated, "Death is not a fearful thing. It's living that's cursed. I've lived too long. I'm tired of this wretched world." Such statements became increasingly common as his physical and mental state worsened. His relationship with his followers also changed dramatically. Though always authoritarian, Jones had previously maintained a facade of compassion. In Jonestown, he became openly abusive, subjecting followers to public humiliation and bizarre tests of loyalty. Former Temple member Deborah Blakey described one such incident. He ordered elderly members to eat rotten food while everyone watched. When they vomited, he mocked them as weak and accused them of being infiltrators. These were people who had sold their homes and given everything to follow him. Perhaps most chilling was Jones's growing preoccupation with revolutionary suicide. What began as philosophical discussions about dying for one's beliefs evolved into concrete planning. Under his direction, Temple Dr. Larry Schacht researched painless methods of mass death and began stockpiling cyanide in early 1978. As November approached, Jones's broadcasts became increasingly fatalistic. "There's no way they're going to allow us to survive," he told his followers just weeks before the massacre. "The only peace we'll ever have is in the grave." The concept of the White Knight emerged in Jonestown as one of Jim Jones's most powerful psychological tools for control. These emergency drills, often called in the middle of the night, conditioned followers to respond unquestioningly to crisis and ultimately prepared them for the unthinkable. "Alert, alert, alert!" The announcement would blare over Jonestown's loudspeakers at unpredictable hours, sending residents scrambling to the central pavilion. Children would be woken from sleep, the elderly hurried along pathways. Everyone expected to assemble within minutes. Odell Rhodes, one of the few survivors of the massacre, described the scene. Armed guards with rifles and crossbows would surround the pavilion. No one was permitted to leave. Sometimes these drills would last for hours, even entire nights. You'd see mothers trying to comfort crying children, elderly people struggling to stay awake, all while Jones ranted about imminent attacks. Once assembled, Jones would announce that mercenaries or CIA agents were approaching Jonestown, intent on torturing residents and destroying their community. His voice, amplified through the pavilion speakers, would grow increasingly frantic as he described the horrific fates awaiting them if captured. "He told us they would take our children away," recalled survivor Laura Johnston Cole. "He said they'd put the babies on bayonets, that they'd torture us and conditioned us to believe that death was better than capture." After hearing this repeatedly, Many people genuinely believed it was true. Jones would then present what he called options to the community, though they were framed to lead to a predetermined conclusion. These typically included attempting to flee to the Soviet Union, staying to fight the attackers, escaping into the jungle, or committing what he termed revolutionary suicide. The most disturbing aspect of these drills was the simulation of mass suicide. During at least 2 white nights, Jones ordered everyone to drink what they were told was poison. In testimony to the FBI, Deborah Layton described one such incident. We filed past a table where we were each given a small glass of red liquid. Jones told us it contained poison that would kill us within 45 minutes. Children were the first to drink, followed by the elderly. Everyone complied. We sat together waiting to die, some people crying, others praying, many writing farewell notes. After the designated time passed, Jones announced it had just been a loyalty test. These mock suicides served multiple purposes. They identified potential resistors, who could then be subjected to punishment or closer monitoring. They desensitized people to the idea of suicide as a political act. Perhaps most importantly, they established Jones's total control over life and death decisions. What Jones accomplished through these rehearsals was the systematic dismantling of personal boundaries, explained cult psychology expert Dr. Robert Lifton. The White Knights eroded individuals' survival instincts and replaced them with group obedience. By repeatedly bringing followers to the brink of death and then pulling them back, he created a psychological dependency on his mercy. The most infamous White Knight, known as the 6-Day Siege, occurred in September 1977, after Jones learned about custody orders for John Victor Stone. For nearly a week, the entire community remained on high alert, patrolling the perimeter with machetes and homemade weapons, while Jones maintained a constant state of panic over the radio. Christine Miller, who would later be the only person heard challenging Jones during the final death tape, described the 6-Day Siege. We were exhausted, terrified, and completely isolated. Jim had us convinced that soldiers were surrounding us in the jungle. People were collapsing from exhaustion. When it finally ended, those who had performed well during the crisis were praised as heroes. The rest of us were shamed. By rehearsing death repeatedly, Jones normalized the unthinkable. When the actual moment came on November 18, 1978, the community had been conditioned to follow the familiar script, except this time, the poison was real. The line between rehearsal and reality had been deliberately blurred, noted FBI psychologist Alan Berkowitz. For many Temple members, that final assembly didn't seem fundamentally different from the dozens of White Knights they'd already experienced. The psychological groundwork for mass suicide had been meticulously laid over months of preparation. As the community of Jonestown grew increasingly isolated in the Guyanese jungle, a network of concerned family members back in the United States was mobilizing. In late 1977, a pivotal meeting took place at the home of Jeannie Mills, a former high-ranking Temple member who had defected. This gathering marked the formal beginning of what would become known as the Concerned Relatives. At the heart of this group was Timothy Stone, once Jones's most trusted legal advisor, and now his most formidable adversary. Stone and his wife Grace were fighting a bitter custody battle over their 5-year-old son, John Victor Stone, who remained in Jonestown under Jones's control. When I left the temple, Jim refused to return my son, Grace Stone later testified. He told me, "You can leave, but John stays with me." That's when I realized the extent of his control. He viewed our children as his possessions. The Stone's custody battle became a flashpoint that would ultimately set in motion the chain of events leading to tragedy. Court documents from September 1977 show Guyanese judges issuing orders for the temple to produce young John Stone, orders that Jones flagrantly defied. Jones was obsessed with keeping John, recalled temple defector Deborah Layton. He claimed to be the child's biological father and said he'd rather die than give him up. When those court orders arrived, that's when the first White Night happened. Jones told us, "They're coming to take our children," and everyone panicked. The concerned relatives weren't merely focused on individual custody cases. They systematically documented allegations of abuse, human rights violations, and illegal activities within the temple. Their efforts grew more coordinated and sophisticated as they collected affidavits from former members, detailing physical abuse, financial exploitation, and sexual misconduct. In January 1978, Stone authored a detailed white paper addressed to Congress, outlining the group's concerns about U.S. citizens being held against their will in Jonestown. This document prompted 91 members of Congress to write letters to Guyana's Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, requesting investigation. "We believe American citizens are being held in a situation of virtual slavery," read one congressional letter. "We request your government's intervention to ensure their freedom of movement and communication." On April 11, 1978, the concerned relatives took their most public action yet. They distributed a packet of documents titled "Accusation of Human Rights Violations by Reverend James Warren Jones" to the media, members of Congress, and the State Department. This dossier contained letters, affidavits, and photographs providing evidence of abuses. June 1978 brought another devastating blow to Jones's credibility when Deborah Layton, who had managed to escape Jonestown that May, provided a detailed affidavit describing conditions in the settlement. "I witnessed people being beaten for minor infractions," her statement read. Passports and money were confiscated upon arrival. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter at all times. Jones repeatedly stated that he would rather have us all die than be taken from Jonestown. The media, initially hesitant to investigate the respected People's Temple, began to take notice. In August 1978, San Francisco Examiner reporter Tim Reiterman published a series of exposés based on interviews with the temple defectors. These articles detailed Jones's drug use, physical abuse of members, and the increasingly apocalyptic tone of his leadership. Inside Jonestown, these external pressures transformed Jones's already paranoid worldview into something far more dangerous. Temple members who monitored shortwave radio would summarize news reports for Jones, who would then distort and exaggerate them in his addresses to the community. "Every time a negative article appeared, Jones would call us together," remembered survivor Odell Rhodes. He'd say, "They're trying to destroy everything we've built. They want to take you back to America where black people are still treated like animals." He made it seem like the concerned relatives were tools of a fascist government conspiracy. In response to mounting scrutiny, Jones hired conspiracy theorists Mark Lane and Donald Freed in July 1978 to craft a narrative of government persecution. Lane held press conferences claiming the temple was the victim of a massive conspiracy by intelligence agencies. But Jones's private actions revealed his true state of mind. Temple records show that by August 1978, he had begun ordering increased shipments of cyanide to Jonestown, ostensibly for mining and jewelry making. Medical staff were instructed to research methods of mass euthanasia. A memo from Jones's files dated October 1978 reads chillingly, "When conditions render impossible the continuation of the project, we must be prepared to take revolutionary action. All members should be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, rather than return to the oppressive conditions of America." As Congressman Leo Ryan began planning his investigative visit to Jonestown in November 1978, the temple teetered on a precipice. Jones's deteriorating physical and mental state, combined with the increasing external pressure from the concerned relatives and media scrutiny, had created a powder keg waiting for a spark. By November 1978, pressure on Jim Jones and his People's Temple had reached a breaking point. Enter Congressman Leo Ryan, a 53-year-old Democrat representing California's 11th District, who would soon embark on a mission from which he would never return. Ryan's interest in Jonestown wasn't arbitrary. The congressman had developed a reputation as a hands-on investigator who preferred direct observation to second-hand reports. Years earlier, he had gone undercover as a prison guard at Folsom State Prison to investigate conditions firsthand. This same determination would drive him to the remote jungles of Guyana. Leo wasn't someone who could be satisfied with just reading reports, recalled his aide Joseph Halsinger. When constituents came to him with concerns about family members in Jonestown, he felt personally responsible to investigate. Among those constituents was Sam Houston, whose son Bob's mysterious death near train tracks in October 1976 occurred just days after he had discussed leaving the temple. The connection was too suspicious for Ryan to ignore. The congressman's official delegation reflected the complexity of his mission. Ryan brought his legal advisor, Jackie Spear, a 28-year-old attorney who had helped him prepare for the investigation. Richard Dwyer, deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, would serve as the State Department's representative. The media contingent was substantial. NBC News sent reporter Don Harris, cameraman Bob Brown, and sound technician Steve Sung. The San Francisco Examiner dispatched Tim Reiterman and photographer Greg Robinson. Charles Krause represented the Washington Post, while Ron Javers covered for the San Francisco Chronicle. I remember boarding that plane to Guyana with a mix of professional excitement and personal dread, Reiterman later wrote. We knew we were pursuing an important story, but the threatening letters from the temple's attorneys made it clear this wasn't going to be a routine assignment. Ryan also allowed representatives from the concerned relatives to join, including Tim and Grace Stone. Their presence was particularly provocative given Jones's obsession with their son John. Before departing, Ryan sent a telegram to Jones announcing his visit. I would like to meet with you and observe the settlement in Jonestown. I am coming in a spirit of cooperation and fact-finding, not confrontation or accusation. Behind the scenes, Jones was anything but welcoming. Temple attorney Mark Lane claimed the visit violated their religious freedom. Jones, increasingly paranoid, prepared his followers through rehearsals designed to present an image of contentment and normalcy. We practiced songs and performances for days, recalled survivor Odell Rhodes. Jones coached people on exactly what to say if questioned. Anyone considered potentially problematic was hidden away during the visit. On November 14, 1978, Ryan and his entourage arrived in Georgetown. For 3 days, Temple attorneys Lane and Charles Gary stonewalled, attempting to prevent the delegation from reaching Jonestown. Finally, on November 17th, faced with Ryan's determination to proceed with or without invitation, Jones relented. The delegation landed at Port Katuma's dirt airstrip, 6 miles from Jonestown. From there, they traveled by truck to the settlement where they encountered a community that, at first glance, appeared idyllic. Children performed songs, residents praised Jones, and a feast was prepared. But beneath this carefully orchestrated facade, danger was brewing. While conducting interviews with residents, reporter Don Harris received a folded note from Temple member Vernon Gosney. Please help us get out of Jonestown. As night fell on November 17th, Ryan and several delegation members stayed in Jonestown while others returned to Port Kaituma. That night in the community's pavilion, Jones appeared distressed and rambled about conspiracies, martyrdom, and enemies plotting destruction. On the morning of November 18th, the facade began to crack. Several families approached Ryan requesting to leave with him. Jones, while outwardly accommodating, grew increasingly agitated. During an interview, when Harris confronted Jones with the note from Gosney, Jones's expression darkened visibly. We've made a paradise here, Jones insisted, his speech slurred from medication. These people are lying. They've been influenced by the enemies who want to destroy what we've built. As defectors prepared to depart with Ryan, the congressman told Temple attorney Charles Gary that his report would be basically positive. But Jones was beyond reassurance, muttering to Gary, all is lost. As Ryan's party and the defectors boarded trucks to return to the airstrip, the congressman was attacked by Don Sly, a Temple member wielding a knife. Though quickly subdued, this assault convinced Ryan it was time to leave immediately. What Ryan couldn't know was that Jones had already set his final plan in motion. Back at the airstrip, as the delegation prepared to board their planes, a tractor pulling a trailer approached. Inside were members of the Temple's security team, the Red Brigade, armed and under orders from Jones that no one should leave alive. The airstrip at Port Katuma would soon become the site of a massacre that would mark the beginning of the end for Jonestown and everyone inside it.